Dakota Territory, August 1883. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. Men sought shade, horses stood with heads hung low, and the very air seemed to shimmer with exhaustion. Yet one man, Elias Nilsson, was digging. He was not digging a well, nor was he clearing a plot for a late-season garden. He was excavating a trench of absurd proportions, a massive U-shaped scar behind the small foundation of his future cabin. He worked with a quiet metronomic rhythm: shovel in, lift, turn, throw. The pile of dark soil grew into a formidable rampart beside the hole. Travelers on the main track would slow their wagons. Neighbors would lean on their fences, chewing on stalks of prairie grass, and watch. They saw a man engaged in what could only be described as profound foolishness. He was digging his own home into a shallow grave. Thomas Gable, the man who had built nearly half the structures in the valley, rode out to the Nilsson claim one afternoon. Gable was a man whose competence was written in the straight lines of his roof ridges and the tight joinery of his dovetailed corners. He was respected. His word carried the weight of seasoned lumber. He watched Elias for a long time, his silence a form of judgment. Finally, he spoke, his voice dry as the dust. "Nilsson, what are you doing?" Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He was not a large man, but he was dense with the kind of strength that comes from relentless labor. "I am building my house, Mr. Gable." Gable gestured with his chin at the enormous pit. "It looks more like you're burying it. That much earth packed against your walls will suck the life right out of your fire. It's a tomb you're building, not a home." Elias simply nodded, his blue eyes calm and unreadable. "The earth will keep us." He then returned to his digging, the conversation clearly over. The community had its verdict. They gave the project a name, one that was whispered at the trading post and spoken with a smirk over church supper. They called it Nilsson's Folly. What did this quiet Swede, this newcomer with dirt under his fingernails and strange ideas in his head, understand about survival that every seasoned pioneer and expert builder in the Dakota Territory had missed? The answer would come, not in words, but in the heart of the deadliest winter any of them had ever known. And it would change the way they saw the very ground beneath their feet. If you want to see how ancient wisdom can defy modern certainty, hit that subscribe button right now and join us for Tales of Forgotten Engineering. To understand the folly, you first had to understand the fear. Winter in the Dakotas was not a season, it was a predator. It stalked the plains from November until April, a relentless, invisible beast of cold. It was a physical presence that seeped through the thickest logs and found every tiny gap in the chinking. The standard of survival was the log cabin. It was a fortress of timber, a testament to hard work and tradition. Men like Thomas Gable had perfected its construction. He used seasoned oak and pine, hewed flat on three sides, leaving the outer curve to shed the weather. His dovetail notches were so precise you couldn't slip a knife blade into the joint. He insisted on a mixture of clay, sand, and horsehair for chinking that cured as hard as stone. On paper, and to the eye, these were formidable structures. They were monuments to self-reliance. But inside, during the deep cold of January, they were scenes of a desperate, losing battle. The problem was a paradox of physics that every settler felt in their bones but few could articulate. A log, no matter how thick, is a poor insulator. It has an R value a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1.4 per inch. A 12-inch log wall, a massive and expensive undertaking, offered an R value of around 16. It sounded impressive, but it was not enough. The cold outside would conduct straight through the wood. The interior surface of the logs would become intensely cold, often coated in a fine, glittering layer of frost. This created a phenomenon known as radiant heat loss. A person sitting near the wall would feel warmth being pulled from their body, leached away by the frozen timber, even if the air in the center of the room was warm. The only solution was the cast iron stove, kept roaring day and night. The stove became the tyrannical heart of the home. Life was lived in a small radius around its heat. Venture too far, and the cold would bite. Water buckets left near the wall would freeze solid. Ink would turn to slush in its well. At night, families would sleep huddled together, their breath crystallizing on the woolen blankets. The cost was measured in firewood. A family might burn through a staggering 10 to 15 cords of wood in a single winter. This meant that a man's autumn was not spent hunting or improving his claim. It was spent in the relentless, back-breaking labor of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking a small mountain of fuel. Wood was life, and they were burning it at a terrifying rate just to stay level with misery. The air itself became an enemy. To feed the voracious stove, you needed oxygen. This air was drawn from inside the cabin, and it had to be replaced. It came in as icy drafts through every crack and crevice, around every window frame and under the door. So you would chink the cabin tighter, trying to stop the drafts, only to find the fire sputtering and the air growing thick and stale with smoke and human breath. A tight cabin was a suffocating cabin. A drafty cabin was a frozen one. It was an impossible choice. Elias Nielsen had known a different kind of cold. He had grown up in the Swedish province of Dalarna, a land of deep forests and long, dark winters. The cold there was just as profound, but the response to it was ancient and fundamentally different. He had not lived in a log cabin, but in a home partially built into the earth, with a massive central masonry heater, a kakelugn, that burned small amounts of wood with incredible efficiency and radiated gentle heat for hours. He understood that wood was a poor barrier against the cold. Wood fought the cold and always lost. But the earth did not fight. The earth did not insulate in the same way. The earth was a battery. It absorbed and held temperature with immense patience. Below the frost line, just a few feet down, the ground held a constant, steady temperature, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It was not warm, but crucially, it was not sub-zero. When Elias looked at the Dakota Plains, he didn't see a flat, exposed surface to build upon. He saw a boundless reservoir of stable temperature waiting to be used. The settlers saw the earth as something to be conquered. Elias saw it as an ally to be embraced. His neighbors were building wooden boxes that leaked heat like sieves. He intended to build a home nestled in the steady embrace of the planet itself. The construction of Nielsen's folly became a source of local entertainment and cautionary tales. The work began after the Great Trench was dug. Elias laid a foundation of heavy fieldstone, wider than any gable had ever seen. On this, he began to build 2 walls. The outer wall was not a house wall. It was a retaining wall. built of rough-hewn cottonwood logs, laid horizontally and tied back into the earth bank with deadman anchors, long logs buried deep in the soil. This was the structure that would hold back the tons of earth he intended to pack against his home. It was crude, heavy work, and to the onlookers, it seemed a colossal waste of timber for what was essentially a fence. Inside this U-shaped retaining wall, he built the actual walls of his cabin. These were also log, but he spent less time on their exterior finish. They didn't need to be perfect. They would never see the weather. The real work happened in the space between the two walls, a gap that was nearly 4 feet wide. This was the part that truly baffled everyone. With the help of his wife, Anna, and his 2 young sons, Elias began backfilling this gap. But he didn't just shovel in the dirt he had excavated. He worked in careful layers. First, a thick layer of coarse gravel against the outer retaining wall for drainage. Then, he mixed the dark topsoil with clay and straw, creating a dense, heavy mixture. He packed it down in layers, watering it slightly, and tamping it with a heavy log until it was firm and solid. He was, in effect, building a man-made hill around 3 sides of his house. The south-facing wall was left open to the sun, with 2 large windows. The north, east, and west walls were disappearing behind a solid, 4-foot-thick barrier of packed earth. Thomas Gable came by again, this time with a genuine, almost paternal concern. He found Elias wrestling a log into place for the inner wall. "Son," he said, the word carrying a mix of pity and frustration, "I've tried to tell you, earth is not an insulator, it's a conductor. All that damp soil is going to rot your logs in 5 years, and in the winter it will freeze into a solid block of ice 4 feet thick. It will pull every last scrap of heat from your home. You're building an icebox for your family." Elias paused, breathing heavily. He looked at Gable, and for the first time, a flicker of his own certainty showed through. "It is not for insulation, Mr. Gable. It is for mass. The frost will not go so deep. Below, the earth is never frozen. That is the heat I will use." Gable just shook his head and walked away. The man was speaking nonsense. Mass. What did mass have to do with staying warm? It was dead air, wool, goose down, that's what kept you warm, not a pile of dirt. But the strangest part of the construction was yet to come. Before he laid the floor joists, Elias dug another, smaller, trench. This one ran from the spot where his iron stove would sit, straight out, under the foundation, and extended a full 50 feet south of the house, buried 4 feet deep. Inside this trench, he carefully laid a series of glazed clay pipes, each about 8 inches in diameter, fitting them together snugly. The far end of the pipe terminated in a vertical stack that rose about 3 feet from the ground, capped with a hood of tin to keep out rain and snow. The other end terminated in a simple, screened opening in the floor right next to where the stove would be. This was the final piece of the puzzle, and the one that cemented his reputation as a madman. He had built a tunnel to pipe winter air directly into his house. "He's feeding the wolf at his own hearth," one farmer muttered at the trading post. "That pipe will pour air at 20 below zero straight onto his floor. The stove will have to fight twice as hard. The man is an idiot." Gable heard this and felt a grim sadness. He knew exactly what would happen. The stove, a closed system, needed combustion air. In a normal cabin, it sucked this air from the room, causing drafts. Nilsson's pipe would provide the air directly, yes, but it would be frigid air. It would create a localized zone of extreme cold on the floor, And, because the air was so cold and dense, it would actually cool the firebox, leading to incomplete combustion and less heat output for the same amount of wood. It was not just foolish, it was counterproductive. He had invented a way to make his stove less efficient. Elias offered no defense. When asked about the pipe, he would only say, "The stove must breathe, the house must not." He continued his work, laying the floorboards, raising the roof, and chinking the gaps in his inner walls with a meticulous care that seemed wasted on a structure so fundamentally flawed. By October, the house was finished. It looked strange. From the south, it appeared almost normal, a small, sturdy cabin with a sun-drenched face. But from any other angle, it seemed to be sinking into the prairie, a low-slung structure with a roof that appeared to grow directly from a gently sloping hill. The only things marking it as a dwelling were the stone chimney and the odd little pipe sticking out of the ground 50 feet away. Nielsen's folly was complete. Now, the physics that Gable and the others could not see. The 4-foot-thick earthen wall was not insulation. Elias was right. It was a thermal battery. Throughout the late summer and early autumn, the sun warmed the earth, and that warmth slowly, patiently migrated deep into the packed soil. The sheer mass of it could hold an incredible amount of energy. By the time the first frosts came, that earthen envelope was not at the ambient air temperature. It was holding a residual warmth, a memory of summer. As the winter deepened, the outer layers of earth would freeze, but the frost would penetrate slowly, deep within the mass and against the cabin's inner walls. The temperature would stabilize, not at the 70 degrees of a heated room, but at the 40 or 50 degrees of the deep earth. This changed the entire equation of heat loss. In Gable's cabin, the interior walls were fighting a battle against sub-zero air. The temperature difference was immense, perhaps 90 degrees, from 70 inside to -20 outside. Heat flowed rapidly across that gradient. In Elias's cabin, the inner walls weren't exposed to -20 degree air. They were pressed against a 40-degree thermal mass. The temperature difference was only 30 degrees. The rate of heat loss through the walls would be drastically, almost unbelievably, lower. The house wasn't insulated from the cold. It was coupled to the planet's stable warmth. And the pipe, the feature everyone mocked, that was the masterstroke. It was a rudimentary earth-to-air heat exchanger. As the -20 degree air was drawn into the pipe's opening, it began its 50-foot journey through a tube buried 4 feet deep in soil that was a constant 50 degrees. The immense thermal mass of the surrounding earth would warm the column of air as it traveled. By the time that air entered the cabin through the floor vent, it was no longer -20 degrees. It had been pre-warmed to 35 or 40 degrees. The stove was not being fed a blast of Arctic air that would chill the fire. It was being fed a steady supply of cool, fresh, oxygen-rich air that had been stripped of its killing cold. The stove could burn at peak efficiency, and the cabin didn't need to be drafty to supply it. The house could be sealed tight, while the fire breathed easily through its underground lung. Elias Nielsen hadn't built a foolish house. He had built an integrated system, a machine for living, where every part worked in concert with the others. November came with a cold, spitting rain. December brought the first heavy snows and a familiar, bitter cold that settled into the bones of the valley. The settlers hunkered down, beginning the long winter ritual of feeding the stove. Smoke plumed constantly from the chimneys of the log cabins scattered across the landscape. But from the chimney of Nielsen's folly, There was only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke in the mornings and evenings. During the day, often nothing at all. "He's saving wood," Gable remarked to his wife, a knot of worry in his stomach. "He must know his design is failing, and he's rationing. God help them when the real cold comes." The real cold came on the third week of January. It arrived not as a storm, but as a silent, invisible invasion from the Arctic. The sky was a brilliant, pitiless blue. The sun was a white disk in the sky, offering light but no warmth. The mercury in the thermometer outside the general store began to drop. At dawn on the first day, it read 5 degrees below zero. By sunset, it was at 18 below. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the way the stars seemed to crackle, and they muttered that they hadn't seen a sky like that in 30 years. The second day, the temperature never rose above 20 below zero. The world became brittle. Axe handles were slick and treacherous. Metal burned bare skin on contact. The very sound of the world changed. The snow squeaked underfoot with a dry, alien cry. Inside the cabins, the battle became grim. In Thomas Gable's home, the finest built cabin in the region, the stove glowed a dull cherry red. Every hour he fed it with seasoned oak, the best fuel there was. The heat it produced was intense, but it couldn't reach the corners of the room. A thick layer of frost, like a coat of white paint, had formed on the north wall. His wife, Mary, had hung heavy quilts against it, but the cold radiated through them. Their children lived on the floor, on a small island of blankets directly in front of the stove. By the third day, the thermometer at the store was frozen at its lowest mark, 35 degrees below zero. The store owner claimed it had tried to go lower. A fierce wind rose from the northwest, a relentless scouring force that drove the cold deeper into every structure. It was no longer just a cold snap. It was a blizzard, a white hurricane of ice and wind. The community was in crisis. Livestock, caught in the open, froze where they stood. Families began burning furniture to supplement their dwindling woodpiles. The drafts in the cabins were no longer annoyances. They were daggers of Arctic air. In Gable's house, the temperature away from the stove was now below freezing. He had to bring the water buckets right next to the hearth to keep them from turning to solid blocks. He was burning wood at a rate he'd never imagined possible, and his woodpile, which had seemed a mountain in October, was shrinking with terrifying speed. He was a master builder, the best in the valley, and his expertise was failing. His perfect cabin was a cold trap. The principles he had built his life and reputation on were being crushed by the sheer, overwhelming force of the weather. On the morning of the fourth day, as the wind howled and visibility dropped to near zero, a new and terrible thought lodged in his mind. The Nielsens. He pictured their half-buried house, its walls packed with 4 feet of frozen, damp earth. He imagined that foolish pipe pouring -35-degree air straight onto their floor. He saw the thin wisp of smoke they'd had for weeks and understood it not as rationing, but as a sign they had already run out of wood. He was consumed by a vision of a silent, frozen cabin, of a family that had died because of one man's stubborn pride, and because he, the expert, had stood by and let it happen. He had to go. It was an insane, dangerous impulse, but he could not sit by his own fire, slowly losing his own battle. while imagining their fate. He told Mary he was going to check on them. She pleaded with him not to, but she saw the look in his eyes. It was a look of grim responsibility. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible, and stepped out into the storm. The world that greeted him was a screaming, white chaos. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his skin like needles. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, keeping the line of a fence to his right, his body bent nearly double against the gale. The journey was less than a mile, but it took him nearly an hour. It was a brutal, punishing trek that drained his strength and chilled him to the core. Several times he thought of turning back, but the image of the silent cabin pushed him forward. As he finally stumbled onto the Nielsen claim, he could barely make out the low hump of the roof against the swirling snow. There was no smoke from the chimney. His heart sank. He was too late. He staggered to the south-facing door, his mind rehearsing the grim discovery he was about to make. He raised a gloved, numb fist and pounded on the thick plank door. He heard a scuffling sound from within, then the scraping of a wooden bar being lifted. The door swung inward, and Thomas Gable was hit by a solid wall of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, humid warmth that felt like a living thing. It washed over him, melting the ice from his beard and making his frozen cheeks ache. He stood there, dumbfounded, peering into the cabin. Elias Nielsen stood before him, wearing a simple linen shirt, its sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Behind him, Gable saw the impossible. The 2 Nielsen children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, were playing on the floor. They were barefoot. They were playing with wooden blocks on the bare plank floor, laughing. In the corner, near the stove, Anna Nielsen was kneading bread on a floured table, a light sheen of perspiration on her forehead. The air smelled of yeast and wood smoke and warm life. There was no frost on the walls, none. The windows had a bit of condensation at the corners, but the panes were clear enough to show the raging blizzard outside, a stark contrast to the scene of impossible domestic peace within. Gable stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the storm. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked around the single room, his builder's eye taking in the details. The stove was not glowing red. It was burning with a calm, steady fire, a small log of cottonwood lazily turning to coal. The wood box next to it was more than half full. Elias. Gable's voice was a hoarse whisper. How? Nielsen simply gestured for him to come closer to the fire. You are cold, Mr. Gable. Come, sit. But Gable didn't move towards the stove. He walked, as if in a trance, to the north wall, the wall that was buried under 4 feet of earth. In his own cabin, this was the wall of ice. He reached out a hand, expecting to feel a deep, penetrating cold, even through the wood. He touched the logs. They were cool, but they were not cold. He pressed his palm flat against them. There was no radiant chill. In fact, if he concentrated, he could feel a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiating back into his hand. It felt like holding his hand near a stone that had been in the sun. He was stunned. He turned and looked at the floor near the stove, where the clay pipe came up. He knelt down, his frozen knees protesting, and held his bare hand over the opening. Air was flowing out of it, a gentle, steady stream. It was cool, yes, but it was not the killing cold of the blizzard outside. It felt like cellar air. He guessed it was maybe 40 degrees. He stood up slowly, his mind struggling to process the flood of contradictory evidence. Everything he knew about heat, about cold, about building, was wrong. The proof was all around him. It was in the barefoot children, the comfortable warmth, the small fire, the full wood box. He looked at Nielsen, who was watching him with that same placid, unreadable expression. "How much wood have you burned, Elias?" Gable asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Since the cold began?" Nielsen considered for a moment. "We use perhaps 4, maybe 5 logs a day, just to keep the chill off in the morning." Gable did the math in his head, his mind reeling. He was burning 4 or 5 logs an hour. He was burning more wood in a single morning than Nielsen was using in a full day. The numbers were not just different. They were from another reality. They were undeniable. He looked at the packed earth wall. He looked at the air intake pipe. He looked at the tight, non-drafty construction. He finally understood. He was looking at a system, a complete thought. His own cabin was a simple box, fighting a war of attrition against the cold. This house was not fighting the winter. It was sidestepping it. It was using the very earth as a shield and a source of stability. All the mockery, all the confident predictions of failure, all his own superior knowledge, it all crumbled to dust in that warm, peaceful room. He walked over to Elias Nielsen, a man he had dismissed as a fool. He stood before him, the expert before the innovator. He took a deep breath, the warm, fresh air filling his lungs. "I was wrong," Thomas Gable said. The words were heavy, tasting of humility and awe. "I was completely and utterly wrong. This is not a folly. This is a miracle. You must teach me how you did this. You must teach us all." The blizzard broke 2 days later. As the valley emerged from the White Siege, stories of hardship and loss began to circulate. Families who had lost livestock, homes that had suffered damage, people who had come perilously close to freezing in their own beds. But another story began to circulate too, a quieter, more astonishing one. The story of Gable's journey to the Nielsen place. At first, it was met with disbelief. People couldn't reconcile the image of a comfortable, warm home with the brutal reality they had just endured. But Gable was a man of unimpeachable credibility. When he told the story, people listened. He described the barefoot children. He described touching the warm north wall. He described the tiny, efficient fire. He didn't just tell the story. He explained the principles as he now understood them. He spoke of the earth not as an enemy, but as a thermal bank. He explained how the immense mass of soil acted like a blanket, shielding the house from the deadly air temperatures and keeping it at the stable temperature of the deep ground. He called the underground pipe the breathing lung, a clever device that gave the stove all the air it needed without letting the winter inside. Skepticism gave way to curiosity, and curiosity gave way to a flood of visitors. Men would ride out to the Nielsen claim, not to mock, but to learn. Elias, a man of few words, would simply show them. He let them feel the wall. He let them feel the air from the floor vent. He showed them his small, tidy woodpile, a fraction of the size of their own. The name Nilsson's Folly died that winter. By the spring, people were calling the design a Nilsson wall or a sunken house. The derisive nickname had become a mark of respect. That summer, a new kind of construction began in the valley. Thomas Gable, the region's premier builder, became Elias Nilsson's most devoted student and his greatest advocate. The first project they worked on together was an addition to the trading post, building a new north wall using Elias's method. Gable, with his practical construction experience, helped refine the technique, developing better methods for waterproofing the outer retaining wall and for anchoring it to the main structure. Elias, with his deep, intuitive understanding, guided the process, ensuring the core principles were not lost. The change was not immediate. Many were still wary of the unconventional design. But every new house built for a young family, every new barn planned for precious livestock, now involved a serious discussion about incorporating at least some of the Nilsson principles. The idea of banking earth against a north wall to blunt the force of the winter wind was the first concept to be widely adopted. The subfloor air intake was seen as more complex, but a few daring homesteaders began to experiment with it. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees or cords of wood, though the savings were staggering. It was measured in human lives. The following winters were still harsh, but they were different. There was less sickness, as families were no longer living in cramped, cold, drafty conditions. The constant gnawing anxiety of running out of firewood began to recede. Children could play in their homes without being tethered to the stove. Life in the valley became less about a desperate battle for survival and more about building a community. The energy once spent on the monumental task of gathering fuel could now be directed elsewhere, to clearing more land, improving livestock, building a school. The innovation born of one man's quiet knowledge had subtly but irrevocably raised the standard of living for everyone. Elias Nilsson never sought fame or fortune. He remained a quiet farmer, content to share his knowledge with anyone who asked. He would walk them through his home, explain the simple logic, and send them away with a new understanding of their environment. He had faced down ridicule not with anger, but with quiet persistence and unshakable faith in a principle he knew to be true. His vindication was not a moment of gloating triumph, but the simple, profound satisfaction of seeing his family safe and his neighbors secure. The story of the foolish mud walls that survived the blizzard became a piece of local legend, a cautionary tale against the arrogance of conventional wisdom. It served as a potent reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not born in laboratories or universities, but are carried quietly across oceans, remembered from the old ways, and reborn out of necessity in the unforgiving soil of a new land. What Elias Nilsson built on that windswept prairie in 1883 was more than just a clever house. It was a demonstration of a timeless truth, that the most elegant solutions are often found not in fighting nature, but in understanding and cooperating with its fundamental forces. The principles he used, thermal mass and pre-tempered air intakes, were not new, but they were new to that place and time. Today, they are foundational concepts in high-performance building and sustainable design. The idea of using the Earth's stable temperature is the basis for geothermal heating and cooling systems. The concept of thermal mass is a cornerstone of passive solar design, using concrete floors and thick walls to store the sun's energy. The underground pipe was a primitive version of what we now call an earth-air heat exchanger, used in advanced HVAC systems to reduce energy loads. The story of Nielsen's Folly reminds us that progress does not always mean inventing something new. Sometimes it means remembering something old. It shows that one person, armed with a clear understanding of a physical principle and the courage to defy convention, can change the world around them for the better. If this story of forgotten wisdom resonated with you, hit that like button to help it find others. And subscribe for more tales of engineering that history almost left behind. This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles discussed, such as thermal mass, earth sheltering, and passive air exchange, are real and have been used in historical and modern construction, the specific characters, names, location, and sequence of events depicted in this story are products of imagination. This content is inspired by historical homesteading practices, but does not represent a specific, documented historical event. It should not be taken as professional architectural or engineering advice.